The announcement that Sweden and Ukraine have agreed on a letter of intent for a major acquisition of Gripen fighter aircraft has already made headlines across Europe. Yet the deeper strategic implications have only begun to surface. In the shadows of this agreement lies a possibility that is even more consequential: the potential involvement of Canada as a manufacturing partner in the production of Ukraine's future combat aircraft. What appears at first glance to be an industrial footnote may in fact represent a structural shift in the evolution of Western defense ecosystems. For decades, the global fighter aircraft market has been shaped by a small group of dominant suppliers: the United States, France, and, to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom and Russia. Sweden, through Saab's Gripen program, has often been viewed as a niche alternative, technically sophisticated, cost-efficient, but limited by production scale and export reach. Yet the confluence of conflict in Eastern Europe, rising demand for air power independence, and the transformation of NATO's security landscape has placed Gripen back at the center of major geopolitical calculations. Ukraine's interest in acquiring between 100 and 150 Gripen E fighters is not just an operational necessity, it is a strategic declaration. Kyiv recognizes that the future of its defense lies in leaving behind the Soviet-era systems that have long defined its capabilities. Every aspect of the war has demonstrated that Ukraine cannot survive indefinitely with aging MiG and Sukhoi platforms. The shift towards Western air power is therefore not symbolic. It is existential. Gripen's role in this shift is critical precisely because of its design philosophy. Unlike many Western fighters, the aircraft is optimized for operations in contested environments where infrastructure is vulnerable and air bases are continuously exposed to strikes. Gripen can disperse rapidly, operate from short or improvised runways, and integrate advanced networking systems that are essential for modern warfare. For Ukraine, whose geography and threat environment demand high survivability and flexibility, this design is not a luxury, but a necessity. Yet the importance of the Ukrainian decision goes beyond capability. Ukraine is signaling its intention to build an air force that is interoperable with the West, but not entirely dependent on any single supplier. The country has observed for years how global politics can shape military assistance, sometimes unpredictably. By pursuing Gripen alongside F-16 platforms, Ukraine is creating a diversified air power structure, one that reduces vulnerability to political shifts in any one country. But the story does not end in Kyiv or Stockholm. In fact, the most strategically intriguing component of this development lies across the Atlantic. Canada, a nation with a long yet interrupted history of aerospace innovation, now stands at the crossroads of a rare opportunity. Saab's public statements have confirmed that Canada is under consideration as a potential site for final assembly, systems integration, or component production for Gripen aircraft destined for Ukraine or other export customers. If realized, this would mark one of the few instances in modern defense history where a non-American fighter is produced inside North America. This possibility carries weight for several reasons. First, Canada's aerospace industry, once globally competitive, has seen mixed fortunes over the last several decades. The country lost one of its greatest innovations, the Avro Arrow, to political decision-making, and later shifted towards commercial aviation through Bombardier. Defense aerospace has largely been defined by participation in US-led programs with limited autonomy. A role in Gripen production would reverse this trend. It would place Canada once again at the center of the global defense aviation supply chain and grant it influence in a domain traditionally dominated by American firms. Second, the involvement of Canada would create a more diversified aviation base within the Western alliance. At present, much of NATO is built around the F-35 ecosystem, with consequences for both interoperability and dependency. While the F-35 is technologically advanced, reliance on a single US-controlled supply chain carries strategic risks, especially in an era in which geopolitical shocks can disrupt the availability of spare parts, maintenance support, and software updates. Gripen's integration into North America would offer an alternative pathway, reducing logistical vulnerability and enhancing the alliance's resilience. From an industrial perspective, Canada presents significant advantages. It possesses a highly skilled workforce, established aerospace clusters, and long-standing experience in advanced manufacturing. It also enjoys strong political and security ties with Sweden, making cooperation feasible at the governmental level. Saab's proposal that Gripens could be built, maintained, and upgraded in Canada is therefore not merely a symbolic gesture. It is a pragmatic recognition of Canada's potential role in reshaping the defense production landscape. However, for Canada, this is more than an economic opportunity. It is a strategic choice. The country has invested heavily in the F-35 program and has built policy frameworks around North American interoperability through NORAD. Choosing to participate in the Gripen ecosystem would not replace the F-35, but it would broaden Canada's strategic options. It would shift the country from the position of a passive consumer to that of an active producer, and from dependence to shared sovereignty. This shift is not without challenges. Canada would need to reconcile the requirements of NORAD with the operational philosophies of Gripen. It would need political commitment to sustain long-term funding for infrastructure, training, and industrial adjustments. And it would need to navigate the geopolitical sensitivities of producing a fighter jet that is not American within a region dominated by US defense structures. Yet these challenges are not insurmountable. They are political and organizational, not technological. Turning to Sweden, the implications are equally profound. Saab's requirement to double production capacity in response to the Ukrainian order indicates a transformation within the Swedish defense industry. What had been a relatively modest production line may soon become a multinational enterprise. Establishing production nodes in multiple countries could mitigate supply chain disruptions, distribute risk, and increase political support for Gripen across different regions. It also positions Saab as one of the few Western defense firms capable of challenging US dominance in fighter exports. This is not simply industrial expansion. It is strategic leverage. A country that produces a fighter jet gains influence. A company that establishes a multinational manufacturing network gains resilience and bargaining power. And a program that integrates the interests of Sweden, Ukraine, and Canada becomes more difficult to disrupt, more politically protected, and more strategically valuable to NATO. The involvement of NATO adds an additional layer of complexity and opportunity. If Gripens are produced in Canada for Ukraine, the alliance's industrial ecosystem becomes more decentralized. NATO has long depended on US capabilities, but diversification enhances collective security. It reduces the risk that a single point of failure, whether industrial, political, or logistical, can weaken the alliance. In a world of contested supply chains, redundancy is strength. Yet diversification also introduces tension. The US may view Canada's participation in a non-American fighter program with mixed reactions. While Washington benefits from stronger allies, it also seeks to maintain leadership in defense technology. A more balanced ecosystem could challenge that leadership, at least symbolically. Nevertheless, the US also recognizes the value of having allies that are industrially capable, especially during prolonged conflicts where production capacity is as important as battlefield performance. And finally, there is Russia, an actor whose perceptions will shape future conflict dynamics. The arrival of Gripen aircraft in Ukraine would disrupt Russian planning at every level. Gripen's design directly challenges Russian air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and reliance on large, centralized air operations. For Russia, a Ukraine equipped with modern fighters produced through a resilient international supply chain is far more threatening than a Ukraine relying on aging Soviet jets or inconsistent Western donations. The strategic message is clear. Ukraine is not only defending itself, but rebuilding its military on a modern Western foundation. And because this foundation includes Sweden and potentially Canada, the conflict takes on a broader geopolitical dimension. Russia is no longer facing a single adversary, it is facing the emergence of an integrated defense network with distributed industrial depth. By the end of this first section, it becomes evident that the Gripen Ukraine-Canada alignment is far more than a procurement story. It represents a shift in how the Western alliance distributes production, maintains resilience, and prepares for long-term strategic competition. The decisions made now by Ottawa, Stockholm, and Kyiv will shape not only the war in Ukraine, but the architecture of European and North American security for decades to come. The trajectory set in motion by the Sweden-Ukraine-Canada dynamic now enters a more complex phase, one where political will, industrial capacity, and geopolitical timing must converge. While the foundational logic behind this emerging triangle is strong, its success depends on decisions that have not yet been finalized. And in strategic affairs, the interval between opportunity and execution is where most ambitious defense projects either mature into enduring institutions or collapse into unrealized potential. The first and most immediate step lies with Sweden and Ukraine. The letter of intent represents a significant milestone, but it lacks the enforceable structure of a binding contract. In the defense world, letters of intent often function as political signals, markers of intent rather than commitments. Whether this agreement evolves into a formal contract will depend on financing arrangements, production timelines, and political stability. Ukraine must secure funding through national budgets, international partners, or creative financing mechanisms. Sweden must evaluate its industrial readiness and ensure that it can meet expanded demand without compromising existing obligations. The challenge here is that Ukraine requires rapid delivery, whereas expanding production capacity, especially internationally, takes time. The second determinant is the configuration of multinational production. Saab's openness to producing components or conducting final assembly in Canada represents a strategic recognition that modern defense manufacturing cannot rely solely on domestic facilities. Global threats, supply chain vulnerabilities, and increasing demand for advanced aircraft require broader industrial distribution. Yet, multinational manufacturing introduces coordination challenges. Production standards must be harmonized. Workforce training must meet Swedish quality requirements. Export controls must be aligned. These are not insurmountable obstacles, but they require diplomatic skill and long-term government-to-government cooperation. If Canada indeed becomes part of the Gripen supply chain, it must prepare for a level of industrial integration not seen in decades. The Canadian aerospace sector is capable, but it has never produced a modern fighter aircraft independently. The last ambitious effort, the Avro Arrow program, was cancelled before reaching maturity. Since then, Canada's defence industrial activity has centred on maintenance, upgrades and subsystem production within larger foreign programs. A Gripen facility would therefore mark a return to true sovereign aerospace capability, a shift with profound implications for Canada's strategic identity. This shift extends beyond industrial considerations. Canada's participation in the Gripen program would require a recalibration of its defence architecture. At present, Canada's long-term air power roadmap is anchored in the F-35. Adopting or producing Gripen does not contradict this plan, but it does introduce parallel lines of capability. This diversification could enhance Canada's resilience, but also requires significant political clarity. Policymakers would need to define how Gripen fits into Canada's broader security commitments, including those related to NORAD, NATO and homeland defence. The decision is not binary, but it does involve structural adjustments that must be approached with precision. Turning again to Ukraine, the importance of industrial cooperation cannot be overstated. If Ukraine eventually hosts production or assembly facilities for Gripen, or even contributes components, this would signify one of the most dramatic shifts in the country's defence industry since independence. Soviet-era factories still exist across Ukraine, but they were built for a different era, supporting a different ideology under a different geopolitical system. The transition to Western production methods, regulatory frameworks and quality control systems would represent a leap forward in capability. It would also deepen Ukraine's integration into Europe's industrial base, making the country not just a recipient of military assistance, but a partner in collective defence production. The strategic consequences of this integration would ripple outward into NATO. A Ukraine embedded into Western industrial networks becomes tied to European and North American security structures in a way no treaty could replicate. Economic and defence interdependence often serve as a more powerful deterrent than formal agreements. Russia would recognize that attacking a country whose defence production is integrated with NATO creates risks of escalation far beyond the battlefield. This does not eliminate danger, but it raises the cost of aggression in ways Moscow must calculate carefully. Meanwhile, Sweden's role in the alliance will expand significantly. Producing fighters for a European nation at war represents a strategic commitment that elevates Sweden's status within NATO. While Sweden has long been respected for its technological capabilities and defence professionalism, its neutrality in previous decades limited its influence. Full NATO membership, coupled with leadership in rearming Ukraine, transforms Sweden from a peripheral actor into a central pillar of European air power strategy. For decades, NATO's air power landscape has been shaped by American dominance. In practice, this resulted in a high degree of standardization and dependency around US systems. While this has benefits for interoperability, it also creates vulnerabilities. If something disrupts the American defense supply chain, or if political developments constrain US export capacity, NATO's ability to sustain operations could be affected. Sweden's rise as a major supplier of modern combat aircraft adds depth to the alliance's industrial base, and if Canada joins as a production partner, the diversification becomes even more pronounced. This evolution is taking place against a backdrop of increasing global instability. The war in Ukraine has reawakened Europe's recognition of long-term security threats. China's military expansion places pressure on global supply chains. The Middle East remains volatile. In such an environment, alliances must be adaptable, resilient, and capable of sustaining long-term readiness. Fighter production is not simply a technological endeavor. It is a pillar of strategic endurance. Countries that cannot produce advanced aircraft must rely on others. Countries that can produce them influence the future. The potential Gripen production triangle, Sweden, Ukraine and Canada, reflects this new reality. Each country gains different advantages. Sweden gains industrial scale and political influence. Ukraine gains a pathway to long-term air superiority. Canada gains a revival of sovereign aerospace capability. But all three benefit from shared resilience. A networked production ecosystem is far harder to disrupt than a single-source model. In an era of contested geopolitics, resilience is a strategic asset. Russia's response to this evolution will likely be multifaceted. Moscow may increase its efforts to disrupt Ukrainian infrastructure, including potential industrial sites. It may attempt to pressure Sweden diplomatically or economically. It may leverage propaganda to portray the Gripen program as provocative. But these actions will not change the underlying reality. Russia's aggression has accelerated Ukraine's integration into the Western defense sphere, and this integration now includes industrial transformation. The United States, too, will closely observe these developments. Washington may welcome the burden-sharing aspect of expanded production capacity. Yet it will also evaluate how Canada's potential involvement in Gripen affects the broader defense relationship. The US is unlikely to oppose Canada's participation outright, but it may seek assurances regarding interoperability, technology transfer, and alignment with NORAD priorities. Ultimately, a stronger Canadian aerospace sector could benefit the United States, provided coordination remains intact. From a macro perspective, the emergence of a multinational Gripen production network is one of the most significant transformations in Western defense manufacturing in recent years. It marks a departure from the centralized, single-supplier model that has defined the alliance for decades, and it represents a pragmatic response to the demands of long-term conflict, distributed production, diversified supply chains, and shared strategic responsibility. This new reality reshapes not only procurement, but also deterrence. Deterrence is not merely the ability to respond to aggression, it is the capacity to sustain that response over time. A country with limited production capability may deter in the short term, but falter in a prolonged conflict. A country backed by a multinational production network can endure pressure, maintain capability, and continue to modernize. Ukraine's shift toward Gripen therefore strengthens its deterrence posture, especially as Russia faces its own long-term industrial challenges. Canada's decision-making in the coming months will be consequential. If it embraces the opportunity to host Gripen production, it joins a select group of nations shaping the future of Western air power. If it hesitates, the opportunity may shift elsewhere. Defense industries operate on timelines measured in decades, not years. Missing the moment could relegate Canada to the role of observer rather than participant. What becomes clear is that this emerging triangle, Sweden, Ukraine, and Canada, is not simply a diplomatic alignment. It is the scaffolding for a new defense architecture, one that reflects the challenges of the 21st century: distributed industrial capacity, strategic autonomy, alliance resilience, and the recognition that air power is central to national security. The choices made today will shape the next 40 years of European and North American security. They will determine how NATO adapts to a world where conflict is prolonged, supply chains are contested, and technological dominance is no longer guaranteed. And they will decide whether Ukraine emerges from this war with not only its sovereignty intact, but with a modernized, future-ready military capable of sustaining peace. As the details of the Gripen Agreement evolve, policymakers, analysts, and defense leaders must understand that this is not merely a procurement effort, it is a symbol of a much larger transformation, one that links industrial capability with strategic purpose. Sweden, Ukraine, and Canada are not just discussing aircraft, They are defining the contours of a new security order. And that brings us to the conclusion. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or a missed opportunity will depend not on technology, but on political will. If you found this analysis valuable, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing for more strategic deep dives. And share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Canada should step into the Gripen production network? And what impact would that have on NATO's future air power? Your perspective helps guide our next investigations.